The reason for legalizing or keeping legal some drugs and not others has nothing to do with scientific evidence. It's really based in sort of racial prejudices and the association of certain drugs with certain populations, or who is assumed to be using certain drugs. So you've seen the kind of the hardest and most repressive drug policies mirror the populations that the US assumes are using those drugs. So it's used kind of, the anti-cocaine laws were directed at the African American community, the opium laws at the Chinese community in the US, and anti-marijuana laws, the Mexican community. And yeah, I mean, this is the difficulty where you have a country that was the creator and the leader of the war on drugs. It started internally and then, imported and exported its failed policies to the rest of the world with bilateral agreements, and then embedding it in the UN framework. So a lot of what we see today is also the result of what the US has been advocating for. And now we're at an interesting position where the US is, I won't say a leader in drug policy reform, but is considering alternatives within its borders. And that's on two major fronts. The marijuana front, obviously, with 23 states with legal medical marijuana, and 4 states with regulated recreational marijuana, and a whole slew of states that are going to keep voting on it. And I see that just progressing and progressing. So I'd say actually on marijuana reform, the US is moving quicker than anywhere else. And the second major area is criminal justice reform, where you have the Obama administration talking about mass incarceration and trying to roll that back, and being a real advocate for supporting those reforms internally. Unfortunately, we haven't seen some of the reforms that are happening domestically being translated into US foreign policy and its attitude at the UN. Until the US does that internationally, it will still be assumed that what it's doing internally might just be a phase, might just be something that's linked to the Obama administration and isn't yet really internationalized. When you've invested so much in rhetoric and a system that's infiltrated your scientific institutions and your international institutions, it's really hard to roll that back. It's hard to first even admit that they're not working, those policies aren't working, and it's hard to get those institutions that have historically created this as their mandate to actually change track.
So since the mid-'80s or so, Canada had actually begun to introduce needle and syringe programs that then have now expanded across the country. Nowhere near the level of coverage that we actually need yet, but there are needle and syringe programs operating in cities across the country, and usually with government funding from various levels of government. We have, of course, seen for 15 years now, the introduction of a couple of supervised consumption services, particularly in Vancouver. That's where we've had those services operating, and they've been some of the most well-studied examples of supervised consumption services in the world, and really contributed a lot to the literature to demonstrate the effectiveness of these health programs. So there are a number of things where, Canada historically has actually been reasonably progressive compared to many countries in the world on these issues, and that now needs to translate into the policy positions that Canada should be taking in international forums. So we have been calling on the Canadian government, that has been newly elected a number of months ago, to be a strong proponent of harm reduction, to be a strong proponent of public health-based approaches, a strong proponent of evidence-based approaches, of human rights, of opposition to the death penalty. Again, something that Canada historically had been opposed to. We think Canada should be firmly speaking out against the death penalty for drug offences, which is clearly a violation of international law. And that should not be a difficult position for Canada to take. With the question of access to controlled substances for medical purposes, that should be, in a sense, a no-brainer. For pretty much any country, but certainly for a country like Canada, it shouldn't be hard for them to get behind saying we can't let repressive prohibitionist approaches to drugs stand in the way of getting access to these controlled substances for medical purposes, particularly when the drug control conventions themselves speak explicitly about this being one of the purposes of the drug control regime, is to ensure access for medical purposes. Of course, we know in reality that is often not the case.
The symptoms of this problem that we see in Asia is having some of the most extreme forms of punishment for drug trafficking and drug supply, and that's the death penalty for drug offences. In countries like Singapore and Malaysia, those sentences are a mandatory one, where the judge doesn't have discretion on whether to impose the death penalty or an alternative sentence. When someone is arrested for possession of quite a minor quantity of drugs, 15 grams of heroin in Singapore, for example. And this is a problem not just in terms of that this is a violation of international human rights law, it's also a problem in that it's not a deterrence. It doesn't deter people from engaging in drug trade or the drug supply. It's a problem in that it's inevitably people who are engaged in the lowest level of the drug market who end up becoming arrested in possession of drugs. It's not the high-level bosses of the drug trade. People who control the drug trade are often not those who are found in possession of those drugs. It ignores the fact that a lot of times people engage in the drug trade due to poverty, to marginalisation. The Indonesian president, Joko Widodo, he decided that to declare a state of emergency in relation to drugs, and that one key measure that he would take in response to this emergency was to execute everyone on death row for drug offences. So Indonesia proceeded to execute 14 people last year. They've recently made statements that they wish to continue with more executions. And some analysts say that this is part of a political strategy, that he was seen as someone who was not a tough man. He was seen as someone that did not have strong standing or the confidence of his party members, and he therefore decided to take this stance to show that he could be tough. It's political convenience, it's political gain that governments choose to perpetuate and to stay on this path.